Okay, so the third part in this mini series on starting and working with students in session is staying on task. This is a big one because sometimes we're working with younger kids. It can be hard for them to stay on task, especially in a virtual format. Sometimes students just have other things going on in their lives and they might not have the strongest motivation in sessions. Um, so checking in on understanding and motivation with that student as you go through the session is really important. Um, I know that as a student, have been frustrated being like, a teacher would go through like an entire subject and then check to be like, okay, everyone understand right at the end, right? And there might be multiple points where you can check in with that student as you move along the session and be like, okay, I explained this. Do you understand? And if they don't, it's way easier to go back to that smaller concept rather than like at the end of the hour, you go, anything you didn't understand, and they have like a list of four things and you don't have enough time to cover them all. It can slow the process down just a little bit, but it does sort of help with the comprehension you are able to cover. Um, just because we're making sure that we're not leaving students behind in this process. Um, Integrating interests can be a really good way to keep that student on task. In a couple prior videos, I had said that, I used basketball and like sports injury statistics as like a way to get my student engaged with like math and statistics and sort of reading about that. Um, and I think that that really does help keep students engaged is when you lean on those interests and you lean on student strengths rather than trying to always push them to do things they absolutely do not want to do. So a lot of times students don't want to read about statistics. I understand this, but being able to integrate those interests so that you can make it a little more appealing can definitely help keep them motivated in those tasks that they might not necessarily want to do independently. Um, so again, that basketball example, and then also leaning on student strengths. Like if there is a student who really struggles with like um biology concepts, I think is a good example. If you're like explaining biology concepts verbally and they just really aren't understanding, they might be a more visual person, so you can draw that out. I know that's always helped me with like drawing out different processes or different like things related to like genes. Really anything sort of like that where the student might be really strong visual learner rather than like an learning from someone speak. um can be really, really helpful in leaning on those strengths and just making sure that you're keeping them motivated in that way so that they don't feel super alienated from the way that you're teaching them. Um, and then it's always really good. Students can get very frustrated, especially when they don't understand things. I think we all do. Um, but encouraging students to work through it while also validating that frustration. I know I always go, yeah, like I understand. I also get frustrated. I also got frustrated a lot by geometry. And I think that's something me and my students have related to a couple times. But encouraging them to work through it and say, okay, like you're really frustrated by this topic. I understand that. You can either take a break, we can think about it a different way, encouraging students to work through it in a way that they hadn't necessarily thought of before. Going back to leaning on those strengths and being like, okay, I know that this sort of explanation doesn't necessarily make sense to you. How is this explanation instead? Or how is this sort of model of thinking about this concept work for you better than how we were talking about it before? Can be really helpful in sort of helping them overcome that frustration and working through that frustration rather than getting bogged down by it and losing motivation throughout the session. And then always asking that if something needs to be re-explained in different words, if students will do the thing where you'll go, you understand? And they'll go, yeah. Um, and that's okay. Because they don't necessarily want to hurt your feelings by them telling you that they don't understand. But you can always be like, you can push them a little more and be like, hey, it's okay if you didn't understand. I can explain it in a different way. And usually if you open up that avenue, they'll be like, yes, please do that. Um, and so that can be really helpful to them because one, it helps establish that trust that you are going to be patient with them if they don't understand something, like you're not just going to completely gloss over it. But it can also, and it can help them become more, um, they can advocate for themselves more in their learning environment, saying, hey, I don't understand this. But it also just helps them understand the topic better because if, you just take their, yeah, as face value, you might get them lost, or they might not still understand the actual topic. So just really checking in to make sure, like, hey, does this need to be explained in a different way? Because I can kind of tell that you might not 100% get it, because we can get you there. And that is, going back to that checking in with motivation as you go, as well as just like validating that frustration and building that trust with the student that they can be frustrated in that space, and that it's understandable to be frustrated sometimes in learning. But giving them those strategies to overcome that, once they're out of tutoring, is a really important aspect of the work we do.